The first thing that caught everyone's attention was the body washing ashore. It was bloated, pale, and lifeless, a stark reminder of the horrors unfolding across the sea. The news spread like wildfire through the coastal town, and soon the locals were digging pits to bury the dead. The men who had set sail with such high hopes were now nothing more than a grim reminder of a failed mission. The year was 1625, and the Kingdom of England was in turmoil. The summer had been long and hot, and the negotiations had dragged on for months. King James, known for his indecisiveness, was finally on the brink of a deal that could change the course of history. The French had agreed to help pay for an expedition to recover the Palatinate, a region in Germany that had been lost to the Habsburgs. But the real sticking point was the marriage of Prince Charles to the Catholic Henrietta Maria. The king had promised to tolerate Catholics, but the agreement was kept secret to avoid public outrage. George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, was at the heart of these negotiations. He had been corresponding with King James, trying to keep the king's spirits up. George had even started calling James his So and Soship, a playful nickname that showed how close they had become. James, in return, sent George gifts like Barbary melons and pheasant eggs, hoping to help him recover from a long illness, but the negotiations were not going smoothly. King James, who preferred hunting to diplomacy, was often dismissive of the French envoy, Effiat. At one point he taunted George, asking where the glorious match with France had gone. Despite the tensions, the deal was close to being finalized by November. The merchant William Whiteway, who followed events closely from his home in Dorchester, noted the excitement in the air. Troops were being drafted, and Count Mansfeld had arrived with 12,000 men ready to fight. The news of the match being concluded was celebrated with bonfires and bell ringing in London. Prince Charles borrowed money to spruce up his palace, and the organ at St. Paul's played for 2 hours, but not everyone was convinced. The Venetian ambassador reported that the deal could still fall apart if Rome didn't grant the necessary dispensation. He also noted a secret agreement signed by Mansfeld, promising not to harm Spain or its allies. The signing of the treaty was a grand affair, but King James, suffering from gout, couldn't attend. Charles took his place, and the celebrations continued. George, however, was already planning a broader alliance to challenge the Habsburgs. He spoke with the new Venetian ambassador about building a coalition that stretched from Venice to Sweden, from Catholics to Calvinists, all aimed at weakening Spain, but the mission was far from smooth. Mansfeld's army, a ragtag group of tramps and convicts, found themselves stuck at Dover. Supplies ran short, and the men became restless. They began plundering nearby towns, and the local authorities had to declare martial law to maintain order. George had to dip into his own pocket to quell the unrest, and the fleet finally set sail. The plan was to land at Calais and march south, but the French King Louis refused to allow the troops to cross French soil. So Mansfeld was forced to land in the Dutch Republic, where the troops faced harsh conditions. Disease spread, and men began dying in droves. The situation was so dire that some men even took their own lives. Mansfeld wrote to George, urging him to provide more funds and support. George, torn between his loyalty to the king and his commitment to the cause, was in a difficult position. When he received conflicting orders from James I, forbidding the English colonels from helping the Dutch at Breda, the other giving Mansfeld free rein, the mission was thrown into chaos. The situation worsened when the papal dispensation arrived with new conditions. James, who had been so close to finalizing the deal, suddenly threatened to break off negotiations. George, desperate to salvage the situation, had to play a dangerous game of diplomacy. He sent messages in secret ink, and tried to smooth things over with the French ambassador, Effiat. Meanwhile, the Spanish and their allies were making overtures to James, who seemed suddenly eager to reopen peace talks. George, sensing a betrayal, sent a warning to the English ambassador in Madrid, Sir Walter Aston. He reminded Aston of the damage that the return of Gondomar, the Spanish ambassador, could do to the anti-Spanish policy. The merchant William Whiteway, who had been monitoring the situation, reported that the French match was at a standstill and that Gondomar was on his way to London. The court was abuzz with rumors, and George found himself in a precarious position. The mission that had promised so much now seemed on the verge of collapse, and the future of the kingdom hung in the balance. In the midst of all this, the body washing ashore was a stark reminder of the human cost of these political machinations. The age they lived in was one of high stakes and high emotions, where the fate of nations could hinge on a single decision. And as the winds of change blew across the kingdom, George Villiers knew that the next few weeks would be crucial. The match, the mission, and the future of England were all hanging by a thread. In late February, King James, feeling unwell and burdened by the weight of his responsibilities, decided to seek some peace and fresh air at his manor in Theobalds. The quiet surroundings seemed to help him a little, and he soon sent a message to London, asking George to come and visit. Despite recent disagreements, James needed George's company and felt lonely without him. When George, who was very busy with his duties, received the king's request, he was torn. He wrote back, explaining that he couldn't come that night, but promised to join the king the next day, along with his mother, Mary, and his wife, Kate. In his letter, George expressed his deep gratitude and affection for the king, using warm and intimate language. However, James's mood darkened when he received news of the death of one of his old friends, James, the second Marquis of Hamilton. Hamilton had died of a fever, and there were rumors of poison and a Catholic priest's involvement, though these were mostly dismissed. The king was already feeling fragile, and this news only added to his distress. As the days passed, James's health worsened. His gout became more painful, and he had to stay in bed. He felt a deep sense of sadness and fear, and news of his condition began to spread among the medical community. Doctors from the College of Physicians, including the king's chief physician, Sir Theodore Mayerne, gathered to treat him. But despite their expertise, James was never particularly impressed by them, and often grew restless and frustrated with their treatments. On March 8th, James was struck by a tertian ague, a form of malaria. The disease was well known at the time, and its symptoms were easy to recognize: intense shivering, high fever, and heavy sweating. The doctors prescribed a range of treatments to balance the king's humors, including purging and bloodletting. They used complex medicines and ointments, but James found their methods unbearable. Mary and George arrived at Theobalds with their own doctor, John Remington, a country doctor from Essex. Remington was not part of the College of Physicians, but he had a good reputation among the Villiers family. He brought a special medicine, a secret recipe based on mithridate, an ancient antidote. George and Mary believed this medicine had helped cure George the previous year, and had also been effective for other nobles. The king's doctors, despite their reservations, allowed Remington's medicine to be used. George personally applied a plaster and gave the king a dose of the potion. For a few days it seemed to help, and the king's condition improved. He even played cards with George, and was well enough to read a book sent by John Murray, the Earl of Annandale. But on March 21st, the king's condition took a sudden turn. Despite the doctor's best efforts, James began to feel a heaviness in his heart. George and Mary were there, and they applied the plaster and potion again. Some of the doctors were concerned about the timing, but their warnings were ignored. Soon after, the king's condition worsened, and the doctors realized that the treatment might have backfired. James's health continued to decline, and the once mighty king was now fighting for his life. The atmosphere at Theobalds grew tense, and the royal court braced for the worst. The illness of King James grew worse by the day. His symptoms were alarming: panting, raving, and fainting. His pulse became erratic, and he refused a third dose of the potion that had been making him feel worse. Dr. Craig, who was concerned about the king's treatment, confronted the Duke of Buckingham and Princess Mary, but was dismissed from court. Henry Gibb, one of the king's attendants, also protested. Late one night, the king told Gibb to remove a plaster from his body. On Tuesday, March 22nd, 2 weeks into the king's sickness, Lord Keeper John Williams rushed to Theobalds, the king's residence, after hearing that James's condition had become life-threatening. Dr. Chambers, who had been away, returned and was shocked by how much worse the king looked. James was given some broth, which helped him have a bowel movement, and he then fell into a deep sleep. Later that day, he revived a bit, and a small communion service was held in his room. The king shared the sacrament with his son Charles, the Duke, and other court members, who were moved to tears. The doctors, worried about the king's rapid decline, asked to be the only ones allowed to treat him, but their request was ignored. That night, Dr. Chambers and Dr. Ramsay, two of the king's Scottish doctors, were in charge. They heard James muttering about the treatment, saying the potion George had given him was making him burn and roast. The king even asked if they were trying to murder him. The following days were a blur of frantic attempts to save the king. His fits lasted for hours, and when they stopped, his pulse slowed dramatically. His urine showed signs of a serious illness, and the doctors tried to purge the rotten humors from his body, which caused severe diarrhea. The king's speech began to fail, his tongue and throat swelled, and he couldn't drink, leading to intense thirst. Scabs appeared on his tongue. Amid the chaos, 2 foreign agents, code-named Percent and Double X, sent letters to their spymaster in Brussels. They had managed to get into the king's bedchamber and reported the strange tragedies they had witnessed, including the use of plasters and potions that had nearly killed the king. Double X was particularly worried, fearing that if James died, the Duke would have the power to ruin not only the Habsburgs but all Catholic princes. On Friday, March 25th, Sir William Paddy arrived and after seeing the king, said there was nothing more the doctors could do except pray. The next day, the doctors handed over the king's care to George Abbot, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and John Williams. By Sunday morning, it was clear the end was near. The king asked Williams to lead the prayers, and as James's breathing became more irregular, the bishop whispered, "Come, Lord Jesu, come quickly." The king's condition worsened, and just before noon on Sunday, March 27, 1625, he passed away. Within a short time, members of the Privy Council met and declared Charles the new king. A ceremony was held at the main entrance of Theobald's, where Charles was proclaimed king. There was a small mistake when the Knight Marshal, repeating the declaration, called Charles the rightful and dubitable heir, but the mood was too somber for it to matter. James Howell, who had been with Charles and George in Madrid, rode to London to spread the news, only to find the city gates closed. Charles and George arrived at St. James's Palace later that afternoon, and went to St. Paul's Cathedral for evensong. Bishop Laud, upon learning of the king's death, broke off his sermon when he saw the Duke of Buckingham sobbing. After the service, George and Charles had a private conversation that lasted for over 2 hours. Despite the change in leadership, George remained in Charles's favor, much to the surprise of many. The new king's succession was announced that night at Whitehall and Cheapside, but the rain dampened any celebration. The political writer James Howell noted that the realm faced many challenges, including war, a disorganized military, and the king's financial debts. In May 1625, in Paris, the artist Peter Paul Rubens was sketching a portrait of the Duke of Buckingham. Rubens, who was also a diplomat, saw both a relaxed and threatening quality in George's expression. They discussed the need for peace, but Rubens sensed that George was a man of caprice and arrogance, driven by his own daring to either triumph or die gloriously. Rubens was in Paris to deliver paintings to the French Queen Mother, Marie de Medici, for the marriage of her daughter Henrietta Maria to Charles. The wedding, a proxy ceremony, took place on May 1, 1625, at Notre Dame Cathedral. The princess wore a stunning gown, and the ceremony was a display of religious tolerance, with a private mass following the public vows. As Paris celebrated, London mourned the death of King James. The air was heavy with sadness, as the late King James lay in state at Denmark House. His body, preserved with spices and wrapped in lead, was placed inside a lavish coffin covered in purple velvet, with gold accents shining brightly. On top of the coffin was a life-size effigy of the king, dressed in his finest robes, his wooden head painted to look lifelike, wearing his crown and resting on a purple velvet cushion. Despite the Protestant disapproval of such displays, thousands of people came to pay their respects, treating the effigy as a sacred relic. Meanwhile, George, the Duke of Buckingham, was struggling with his own demons. His mental and physical health had taken a turn for the worse, with a painful cyst on his head making him delirious and weak. He was so frail that he had to be carried around in a chair. His grief was intense, and some feared it might drive him to suicide. Charles, the new king, tried to comfort George, promising to be a kinder master than his father. But even Charles showed a hint of impatience, suggesting that George's excessive mourning might show a lack of faith in the new king. Rumors began to spread that James had been poisoned. The Venetian ambassador heard whispers of poisonous applications, and some people wanted an investigation. But the official mourning overshadowed these theories, with sermons and eulogies filling the air. Hugh Holland, a famous poet, wrote a moving piece addressed to George, urging him to help the nation grieve. He questioned why George, known as the Dragon Killer, had failed to defeat the dragon fever that took the king. Holland blamed the royal doctors, who had been unable to save the king despite their best efforts. On May 7th, the day of the funeral, 9,000 people dressed in black gathered for the event. The coffin, now in a magnificent chariot, was carried from Denmark House to Westminster Abbey. The procession was a grand affair, with a long line of people from all walks of life, from poor men to nobles, walking in a specific order. The hearse was followed by Charles, supported by 2 earls, and George, still recovering, walked alone behind, leading the king's favorite horse. The coffin was taken into the abbey, and a 2-hour sermon was delivered by Lord Keeper Williams. George, despite his recent illness, seemed to have found a new sense of purpose. Later that day, Sir George Goring arrived from Paris with news of the proxy marriage celebrations. Henrietta Maria, the new queen, was set to arrive in London the following week. This news lifted George's spirits, and he immediately decided to go to Paris to fetch her. George's preparations for the trip were swift and extravagant. He had already ordered a magnificent wardrobe and planned a large entourage, but he was so eager that he left with just a few trusted friends and servants. They sailed from Dover to France, and the journey was so smooth that George generously tipped the crew, and even gave a gift to the postmaster's family in Boulogne. In Paris, George stayed at the home of the Duc de Chevreuse, who helped him navigate the French court. George's arrival caused a sensation. He was a striking figure, dressed in a diamond-studded white suit, and his charm and energy captivated the French nobility. Everyone wanted to be near him, and he became a sensation at court. However, Henrietta Maria, the young queen, remained distant and reserved. She was pious and strong-willed, and while some found her beautiful, others were less impressed. Despite her coolness, George threw himself into the Parisian life, enjoying the city's pleasures and making grand plans. He even approached Cardinal Richelieu with a bold idea for a League of Nations to challenge the Habsburgs. Richelieu, a clever and calculating man, listened politely but dismissed the idea, citing the ongoing religious conflicts in France. As George's time in Paris went on, his love life became a topic of gossip. His wife, Kate, had always endured rumors about his infidelities, and in Paris, George's charms were on full display. He pursued the French queen, Anne of Austria, with a reckless passion, but she remained out of his reach. George's adventures in Paris only added to the scandal and speculation surrounding his name. Despite the challenges, George's trip to France was a testament to his resilience and his ability to captivate those around him, even in the midst of grief and turmoil. The storm had finally cleared, and the morning of June 12th dawned bright and clear. The waters of the Channel were choppy, but the sky was a brilliant blue, promising a smooth journey ahead. George, the Duke of Buckingham, stood on the deck of the flagship, the Prince Royal, alongside Henrietta Maria, the new Queen of England. His mother and sister were also on board, eager to welcome their new family member to England. Henrietta Maria, dressed in her finest, looked out across the water with a mix of excitement and trepidation. She was leaving behind the familiar world of France for a new life in a land of strangers, but she was not alone. George, with his charm and charisma, had become a trusted friend and advisor, and she felt a sense of security in his presence. As the ships set sail, the crew worked diligently to navigate the choppy seas. George, ever the adventurer, was in his element. He moved gracefully around the deck, ensuring that everything was in order and that Henrietta Maria was comfortable. The new queen, despite her nerves, could not help but smile at the scene around her. The fleet of 20 British ships, each one a symbol of the power and majesty of her new kingdom, filled her with a sense of pride. The journey was long, but the mood on board was light. George entertained everyone with tales of his escapades in France, from his daring attempts to meet Anne of Austria to the elaborate disguises he had worn. Henrietta Maria listened with rapt attention, her eyes wide with wonder. She had heard stories of George's reputation as a ladies' man and a master of intrigue, but to hear him tell the tales himself was something else entirely. As the day wore on, the English coastline came into view. The sight of the white cliffs of Dover, rising majestically from the sea, brought a wave of emotion to Henrietta Maria. She was here now in her new home, ready to begin her life as the Queen of England. George, sensing her feelings, took her hand and squeezed it gently, "You will do well, your Majesty," he whispered. "England is lucky to have you." The fleet anchored off the coast of Dover, and preparations were made for the royal landing. Charles the King was waiting on the shore, his heart pounding with anticipation. He had been anxious about his bride's journey, but now, as he saw the ships approaching, his worries faded. The moment he had been waiting for was finally here. Henrietta Maria, accompanied by George, stepped onto the dock. The crowd that had gathered erupted in cheers, and Charles rushed forward to greet her. As they embraced, the world seemed to pause, and for a moment all the troubles and tensions of the past faded away. George stood back, watching the scene with a sense of satisfaction. He had helped bring this moment to fruition, and he felt a deep sense of pride. But as the celebrations began, George knew that his work was far from over. The road ahead was uncertain, and the challenges many. Anne of Austria, the Queen of France, and her intrigues with Cardinal Richelieu still loomed large. But for now George was content. He had completed his mission, and the new queen was safely in England. As the sun set over the sea, casting a golden glow over the harbor, the future seemed full of possibility. Henrietta Maria and Charles, hand in hand, began their journey to London, surrounded by the pomp and pageantry of their new life. George, ever the loyal friend, followed close behind, ready to face whatever lay ahead. And so the journey began, with the promise of new beginnings and the hope that, together, they could build a brighter future for England.